It is so lovely to be together again, and really I'm more and more conscious of how beloved everybody is to me and how much we mean to one another. So this week we're going to look a little bit at trauma and our awareness of trauma. We won't go into the whole psychology around it, because there are people who are far more adequately trained in that area than I am, and besides which you're welcome to simply go and read up about it. There are all sorts of catchphrases going around at the moment, aren't there? Things like, this is, or these are unprecedented times, business unusual. Can't wait until we go back to things as normal, which we actually mean is familiar things, or the new normal. I'm sure you could add a whole lot of catchphrases to those as well. And either way, whatever the catchphrases are, whatever evolves out of this time, how many of us have stopped to really think about the reality that not only is there a shift on a global level in terms of society, economics, history, whatever we want to name it, and so on. There's also a shift in global consciousness. And again, with any of these kinds of shifts, we don't really know what they mean. We just know that they are. Within those areas, that arena, as we become aware of these newnesses, of these shifts, of these changes, we need also to be aware at the same time that all of us, there's no one who's being excluded, is also in a very lived reality of trauma. And trauma can arise from all sorts of things. It's not only from bad accidents and death, it's also about huge shifts and changes in life. It's about things over which we don't have a great deal of control. It's about coming face to face with our mortality. It's also being aware that so much of what we're going into is unknown. There's an element of shock that is also part of trauma, and loss of what is known, what is familiar, and not at the moment having anything really credible with which to replace it. At least that's how some of us are feeling. Now, those are all common experiences to all of us. It would be very interesting to start looking at how did Jesus cope with trauma. And Jesus did have trauma, and God still inhabits trauma with us. So God isn't excluded. God doesn't not know what we feel about it. Oh, there are so many incidents in Jesus' life when we could look at how he handled it. But for the purposes of length and time, let's just look at a couple of the ones. Things like the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, the death of John the Baptizer, his cousin, the Gethsemane is an obvious one as well, the death of Lazarus, and how that plays out, and some of the things that sort of implied subtleties that we do pick up from those incidents in his life. Well, we know that when Jesus started his public ministry, we hadn't really encountered him as a public figure. We'd had one incident as a 12-year-old in the temple in Jerusalem, but other than that, Jesus has lived very much under the radar, probably continued his earthly father Joseph's work as a carpenter, so not hugely exposed to what it means to have a considerable following, to be a public figure who would perhaps at at times come up against the institution or other forms of leadership. So he comes, he's baptized, and now he's going to go into this massive shift in his public life where he's going to stand for something and people are going to be seeing him as standing against them personally. And in order to cope with the trauma of what that huge change in his life means, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days, and we know he fasted during that time, he prayed, and he certainly drew on a considerable knowledge of the Jewish scriptures, because he's able to reach into the heart of that and draw on some of the scriptures that he knows with every fiber of his being and use that to address all sorts of temptations, for his own comfort, his reassurance, his direction, clarity of thought for himself. Now, when one goes into the wilderness, whether it's actual or not within trauma, what it does is it takes us even deeper into the trauma. Not only does it take us deeper into the trauma, but it faces us with ourselves. And it can be a trigger for a whole lot of other things in our lives, memories, experiences, whatever they are. And if we were to do that in isolation, it would be a recipe for continued and deeper depression. But Jesus doesn't do that. He puts it within the lived context of being in that deeply compelling relationship with God. God who is the ultimate divine physician, God who will always hold us at a more expansive reality so that we don't spiral more and more beyond where we are into a deeper darkness. So the fasting that Jesus also uses there is not only a physical fasting, it is also a fasting from the distractions that other people would provide, so that he wouldn't need to face into some of the challenges that this very traumatic and dramatic shift in his life is going to entail. But he always does it within the safe containment of Abba God. He is praying, and he's praying protection around himself. And so when we are in this trauma, how intentional are we being about putting ourselves into the containment of God? Or are we trying to contain ourselves by distracting, by entertaining, without actually allowing time for reflection? And yes, it's not forever. Jesus doesn't stay in the wilderness for more than 40 days. He does do top-ups, but he doesn't stay beyond that time, because at some point he's got to actually engage in what this change means in his life. Then we come to the beheading or the murder of John the Baptizer, Jesus' cousin. And you'll find that story, of course, in Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 to 13. And John's disciples come and tell Jesus what has happened. And in verse 13 we read, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. You see, Jesus needed downtime. He needed the spaciousness of just being himself, to start to try and get his head around this, what it meant for him, what the political implications might even be for his ministry, but certainly also to deal with the grieving of the heart. We have no doubt that he and John had a close relationship. Certainly his mother and John's mother were very, very close. And so he goes into a time of grieving on his own. It's not a time very much to draw others into it, because he has a unique relationship with John the Baptizer, and so his grieving is unique, and there's a very clear sense of loss that he is experiencing, and he needs to reflect and mourn. And so we need to be intentional too about whatever those losses are in our lives. Yes, even if we're living alone, we sometimes think that, when we live alone, we automatically are doing that, but we don't, because social media is such an easy distractor. And, just to watch out for those things that are indicators that we're still needing to work through at a deeper level with the trauma and with all of what that is entailing in our lives. And there'll be things like, some of the indicators are things like mood swings, angry outbursts that seemingly come out of the blue, depressive cycles, sleeping too much, not sleeping enough, tearfulness, lethargy, all those things that are normative as indicators of trauma. But Jesus doesn't stay there again. He doesn't stay in that morning indefinitely. He returns to shore. You see, he went off in a boat, and then he returns to shore, and a large crowd had been tracking him on the land. And it says here that Jesus had compassion on the crowd, healed their sick, and later on we're told that he actually feeds them physically. It's the feeding of the 5,000 men, not counting women and children. The point is, isn't it, here that feels compassion for them, we've got to be so aware and alert to not letting trauma steal a whole lot of things in our lives. So easy to steal our compassion, to steal our involvement and reaching out to others, our willingness and our capacity to nourish others. And I'm not only talking about nourishment with food. Because Jesus went into prayer, because he invited God into his trauma, the trauma wouldn't have control over his life. God was still very much the director of his life. But he is so in tune with himself that the very next day he sends the disciples off in the boat to cross over the lake. He sends the crowd away, and then he goes up the mountainside. And there he goes and prays. So you get the sense that his own trauma debriefing is ongoing within the companionship of Abba, Father God. And in here we get a couple of other clues about some of the important aspects of processing trauma. One is he climbed up the mountain, so there was physical exercise. He was in nature. Creation herself gives so much of herself in healing power to us, and we would be foolish to deny ourselves some of that grace that God has implanted within that. Then we have the raising of Lazarus from the dead in John chapter 11, beginning at the first verse. Jesus gets to the tomb, he weeps. We may say to ourselves, why is he weeping? He knows Lazarus is alive with God in heaven, besides which when the people who'd been sent by Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, to tell Jesus Lazarus was dying, Jesus had said in verse 4, the sickness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory, so that the Son may be glorified. So what are these tears about? When Jesus does eventually get to the tomb after 4+ days. Well, tears are a normal part of trauma. Jesus might not have been necessarily weeping about Lazarus' death, but certainly would have been weeping for the pain of the world, for the suffering of the world. There's a form of intercessory prayer that is very much part of trauma. And there's a sense of solidarity of the divine being in solidarity with us. The Garden of Gethsemane, and I'm aware we are very much running out of time here. Huge trauma the night before. Physiological manifestations of the trauma. This, kind of sweating blood there. So trauma will bring on physiological manifestations, be it bodily pain, be it actually getting very, very sick. That's normative and it'll affect our entire being. What is important to note here is Jesus' very raw, unedited expression of honest emotion to God. He hides nothing. He also doesn't do it on his own. He asks his closest companions, Peter, James and John, to be with him, to support him. Unfortunately, they don't support him in the way that he had asked them, but it does tell us in our trauma we can choose the companions that we want to draw from their strength and just lay it all on the table until we come through that catharsis. And then in that emptiness, we don't allow the emptiness to consume us, but we surrender all into God. And that's not a giving up. Simply surrendering and believing that emptiness has a fecundity of its own, and that God will fill it with a supernatural peace, a sort of otherworldliness. So honor your trauma as a valid experience during this time and beyond, because it takes time. Read about it, spend intentional time alone, digging deeper, seeing what the triggers are, consciously letting God holding you in it. Pray as you can, not as you ought. Receive what creation is offering you in the need for healing. Pray, meditate, weep, exercise appropriately, memorize, draw on communal support. Keep in touch with your compassion for others and in touch with community. Surrender into God. And remember, we are more than our trauma. Thank you for being together, and let us be our greatest support within the lap of God.